So today I wanted to read an excerpt to you from the book My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakem. And it really highlights a very important piece that is connected with historical and ancestral trauma because often those of us that come from societies that have been colonized will often focus on just that aspect of it. But there is another side to that story, and that is the colonizers, in order for them to behave in the way that they did, maybe they have their own trauma that needs to be reconciled with. And I think that's a really important piece to address because oftentimes I find those that come from colonizer ancestry are in complete denial. Like they want to deny who their ancestors were, not talk about it at all, completely sweep it underneath the rug, and that is just the opposite of what needs to happen. The one of my favorite deflections is, well, I wasn't even alive then. My ancestors, those, it wasn't me. But that still is a deflection, and it's still brushing under the rug a type of healing that can also happen for the colonizers. So those of us, that came from those colonized societies, the Irish, we know we are the testing grounds for everyone else. Sorry to everyone else that had to go through what we went through. But I think it's also, a healing factor too, as you know, if you have come from a colonizer ancestry, to come to some reconciliation about that, to come to some truth about that, and come to some compassion and understanding of what could have led them to become what they did. So, with that, I'll start reading this excerpt. As we now know, however, without a clear and present focus on the body, trauma cannot be fully addressed. One of the purposes of My Grandmother's Hands is to build on de Groy's important work. Another purpose of it is to look a little further back in time than de Groy did. Post-traumatic slave syndrome begins its investigations in the year 1619, when the first Africans arrived in America. These human beings were kidnapped, placed in chains, forcibly relocated, and sold into enslavement to immigrants from Europe and their descendants. However, trauma of this kind did not begin in 1619. For thousands of years before that, the human beings murdered, butchered, tortured, oppressed, abused, conquered, enslaved, and colonized one another. While people from England, Spain, Portugal, France, Scotland, Sweden, and Holland had all colonized parts of America by the late 1600s, it was the English who controlled nearly all the colonized territories in what would become the United States in 1776. The 1500s and 1600s in England were anything but gentle times. People were routinely burned at the stake for heresy, a practice that began in the 12th century and continued through 1612. Torture was an official instrument of the English government until 1640. The famous Tower of London was, in part, a huge torture chamber. One of the many torture devices in the tower, the rack, was used to stretch human bodies and pull them apart. Here is a description of the apparatus at work. This caused terrible pain for the victim as well as increasing physical damage as the torture continued. Tendons were ripped, joints separated, and bones fractured. The sounds of muscles and tendons tearing and snapping provided audible signs of the damage being done. During much of the Middle Ages in England, torture wasn't just wildly popular, it was a spectator sport. In his essay, Violence and the Law in Medieval England, historian Sean McGlynn puts it this way. Throughout the whole medieval period, there was popular demand for malefactors to receive punishment that was both harsh and purposefully terrifying. This reflected the people's enthusiasm and the desire to see justice being done. There was even an executions transfer market. Bids were made to stage the executions of condemned men in front of home crowds. Mutilations sent out a message of warning and deterrence. Executions offered the ultimate guarantee against repeat offenders. With few prisons and no police force, severe punishment was deemed invaluable as a deterrent to crime. In her book, A Distant Mirror, Barbara Tuchman offers parallel descriptions of everyday life in medieval England. The tortures and punishments of civil justice customarily cut off hands and ears, racked, burned, flayed, and pulled apart people's bodies. In everyday life, passers-by saw some criminal flogged with a knotted rope or chained upright in an iron collar. They passed corpses hanging on the gibbet and decapitated heads and quartered bodies impaled on stakes on the city walls. It is not hard to understand why so many people from England fled to the American colonies. Fleeing is, of course, a survival response. Many of England who colonized America had been brutalized or had witnessed great brutality firsthand. Others were the children and grandchildren of people who had experienced such savagery in England. Barbarism was not the only reason to flee England. The Great Plague raged through much of the country in 1665 and 1666, killing an estimated 100,000 people in London alone, almost a quarter of the city's population. In the village of Eyam, or Iam, EYAM, the plague killed 4 out of 5 residents over 14 months. Many English immigrants were desperately trying to get away from poverty, starvation, and overcrowding. For all their talk of the New Jerusalem, the Pilgrims and Puritans were not explorers. They were refugees fleeing imprisonment, torture, and mutilation. In England, one Puritan writer, William Prynne, had his ears cut off and his forehead branded, which was burned with a red-hot iron, with the letters SL, which stood for seditious libeler. Another Puritan, John Milburn, was flogged with a whip, dragged by an ox cart through London, and forced into a pillory. Others had their noses split or their tongues bored with hot irons. In post-traumatic slave syndrome, de Groy asks, isn't it likely that many slaves were severely traumatized? Furthermore, did the trauma and the effects of such horrific abuse end with the abolition of slavery? We need to ask these same questions about the English colonists who made their way to America. Isn't it likely that many of them were traumatized by the time they arrived here? Did over 10 centuries of medieval brutality, which was inflicted on white bodies by other white bodies, begin to look like culture? Did this intergenerational trauma and its effects end with European immigrants' arrival in the New World? The trauma that now lives in the bodies of so many African Americans did not begin when those bodies first encountered white ones. This trauma can be traced back much further, through generation upon generation of white bodies, to medieval Europe. For America to outgrow the bondage of white body supremacy, white Americans need to imagine themselves in black bodies and experience what those bodies had to endure. They also need to do the same with the bodies of their own white ancestors. And they need to ask themselves this question: if we don't address our ancient historical trauma, what will we pass down to our children and to their children and grandchildren? When the English came to America, they brought much of their resilience, much of their brutality, and I believe a great deal of their trauma with them. Common punishments in the New World English colonies were similar to the punishments meted out in England, which included whipping, branding, and cutting off ears. People were routinely placed in stocks or pillories, or on the gallows with a rope around their neck. While they were thus immobilized, passerbys would spit or throw garbage on them. In America, the Puritans also regularly murdered other Puritans who were disobedient or found guilty of witchery. Powerful white bodies routinely punished less powerful white bodies. In 1692, during the Salem witch trials, 80-year-old Giles Corey was stripped naked and, over a period of 2 days, slowly crushed to death under a pile of rocks. 80 years old. I'll spare you further details of the ways in which the English in America and their descendants dislodged brains, blocked airways, ripped muscle, extracted organs, cracked bones, and broke teeth, those of blacks, Native Americans, and other white colonists. However, here is what we need to recognize about this New World murder, cruelty, oppression, and torture. Under the second half of the 17th century, these traumas were inflicted primarily on white bodies by other white bodies, all on what would become U.S. soil. There were some exceptions, most notably the war with the Pequot tribe in the 1630s. Throughout the United States' history as a nation, white bodies have colonized, oppressed, brutalized, and murdered Black and Native ones. But well before the United States began, powerful white bodies colonized, oppressed, brutalized, and murdered other less powerful white ones. The carnage perpetrated on Blacks and Native Americans in the New World began on the same soil as an adaptation of long-standing white on white practices. This brutalization created trauma that has yet to be healed among white bodies today. As I have observed earlier, trauma was not invented in the 17th century. It is as old as our species. But our concepts of whiteness, blackness, and race were invented in the 17th century. While they seem self-evident to Americans today, these concepts would have appeared foreign and bizarre, even outright addled, to an American colonist in the early 1600s. Back then, no one used the term white people other than perhaps as a descriptor, as in white paint, white gloves, white hat. Instead, there were English, Dutch, French, Spanish, and Portuguese colonists, and members of Indian tribes such as Pequot, Narragansett, Wampanoag, and Mohawk. Beginning in 1619, when people from Africa first set foot on American soil, there were also African indentured servants. Although the antecedents of what would eventually become white body supremacy was already established, European colonists and their children did not think of themselves as belonging to the white race or any race. Today, we have a great bounty of written materials, books, pamphlets, diaries, letters, public records, etc., penned by Americans in the 1600s. In all of these, we do not find the descriptive, racialized phrases white person, white man, or white man, white woman until the 1680s. It was only in the late 17th century that white Americans began to earnest to formalize a culture of white body supremacy in order to soothe the dissonance that existed between more powerful and less powerful white bodies, to blow centuries of white on white trauma through millions of black and red bodies, and to attempt to colonize the minds of people of all colors. The concept of the Negro was created to help white Americans deal with the hatred and brutality that they and their ancestors had themselves experienced for many generations at the hands of more powerful white bodies. The phantasm of race was conjured to help white people manage their fear and hatred of other white people. So, what I find interesting about all of this is that, yes, this is from a African American perspective, but as an Irish, cultured Irish, ethnically Irish person, one of the things that I find that happens for us is that all of our history gets erased, and that our own experience in all of this connection also becomes ignored or laughed at or not taken very seriously, because in some ways, especially in America, we were able to blend in. And, when it comes to language and all that sort of thing, and I'll make other videos addressing this, there was such a push to speak English correctly. And part of that was because it was through accent and language that they would be able to blend in. So that's a whole other topic. But I think that was also true for the Irish that stayed in Ireland in order to be able to compete on some, level to gain monetary success was if they hid the language, if they suppressed the language themselves. So they were doing it to themselves, and also in some ways suppressed any accent, then it would be easier for them to compete on, that kind of level as well. So, with that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this. But yeah, this is just one of the many aspects of addressing ancestral or historical trauma, and that it's not just for the colonized, but it's something also to reflect on if your ancestors were colonizers. So, like and follow for more. Bye.